Coming up on this episode of the Ready Test Go podcast.
A lot of people will say, look, I'm trained as an engineer. I'm a technical person. I'm not a moral philosopher. How do I know what's right or wrong? This idea of moral imagination, it just paralyzes me. What do I do? And plus, I don't have a lot of time. Focus on progress, not perfection. Can you get it a little bit better than you would have otherwise if you invest a small amount of time?
It begins with an overarching commitment to the quality of work and human flourishing that's tied to that work in the organizational context. And then a methodology and a set of principles for applying those methods that leads to good social and technical conditions. Working definitions are your friend. So having organizations and design teams develop working definitions can be a very helpful way of unparalyzing yourself.
Making things that really do support human flourishing and flourishing of the planet, and that those become our fundamental criteria. We need the courage to say, not a good idea, attractive technically, but not a good idea, and back off.
What does it mean to be human? Maybe in our world of quick gratification and digital everything, it's simply being present and physical in a moment in time. Our two guests today, Batya Friedman and David Hendry, both find peace in working with their hands. Batya took a quick and passionate interest in sculpting, a meticulous process of chiseling away at stone to ultimately arrive at a finished work of art.
I've probably been doing something artistic since I was tiny, and maybe 20 years ago, I thought stone was really intimidating. I looked around in Seattle for some people who were teaching stone carving, and I found a wonderful person, Sabah Al-Dakhar, an Iraqi American, and started taking courses with him every Sunday for 7 years, and that was it. I just got hooked. When you love stone, you love stone. That's just the way it is. In the beginning, I tried all kinds of tools, from angle grinders and pneumatic drills and diamond tools. And then after a while, I've settled on one tool. It looks a bit like a meat tenderizer, just a hammer with 9 points, and I just tap away at the stone, and it's very meditative and just a real pleasure. So it's also been an exploration of technologies too.
David keeps busy with physical activities as well, everything from growing and canning strawberries to fixing bicycles and building wheels. His children were the inspiration for that focus on tactile activities, and he appreciates the opportunity to constantly be learning something new about the world around him.
When I was a kid, I had many really wonderful experiences working on a farm for a summer, spending time hiking and canoeing and learning a little bit about the natural history of southern and northern Ontario in Canada. And I've been thinking about those experiences over the last few years, and as I've tried to put together some stories for my son and for my nieces and nephews about what it was like to grow up 50 years ago. One of the things that I think about quite a lot, and in a way it's nostalgia, is being outdoors and just doing things, just learning about simple materials and learning to use those materials well. So I can never go back to my childhood, of course, but I can continue to explore really tangible materials around fixing bicycles and learning to make bicycle wheels, learning to plant some strawberries and then turning those strawberries into jam and putting them into a jar, in January, and have some fresh strawberries.
Batya defines these as embodied experiences, and we're embodied people. Rather than shy away from that, they both suggest we lean into our truly human experiences, both within ourselves and our communities.
At the end of the day, we're all embodied. We all exist in our bodies and in our physicality. We all have the kind of sensory apparatus that we have that allows us to absorb things from the environment and from other people, and also to express ourselves. And those are fundamentally physical. So even though we are using digital technologies, still at the end of the day, our experience of the world and as human beings is an embodied physicality.
And when we do engineering work, when we work with values and we work with complicated problems, we are creating systems that tie to people's bodies in one way or another. through eyes or ears or other senses, as Batya was saying. I think having a repertoire of different ways of experiencing things can help you be more imaginative and more perhaps empathetic for different ways in which people experience tools and technologies, especially, we're talking here largely about digital tools and technologies.
For those looking for a passion of their own, the duo recommends following an internal compass rather than relying on extrinsic values to define your interests.
Listen to yourself about what you really love. It's like your own internal compass, gives you a lot of information about what it is in the world that really gives you deep joy. And then think about how to engage in that place with real focus. Maybe get away from thinking about outcomes and more just engagement with the thing that you love. And that could be walking in the woods. It could be, rebuilding an old Thunderbird. It could be baking 3-layer cakes, coconut cakes with coconut icing. It's not the thing itself. It's the thing that really gives you pleasure, and then you just fully attend to it.
I was part of a reading seminar where we were reading a book called The Last Human Job by Alison Poog. Alison Poog is a sociologist, and she was exploring the importance of a term that she uses called connective labor. The interpersonal, relational engagement that you have with people that is outside completing specific or particular kinds of transactions. So it's about the stuff that is really ordinary, like saying hello to a stranger who you encounter regularly and just being aware of each other, for creating those experiences of connective labor or of connection to others in everyday situations can be really helpful both for you and for the person that you're engaged with. I'm always looking for opportunities to create these little moments of connective labor. If someone comes by my office, a visitor to the university or to our department, and says, I need to find this building, can you tell me how to get there? I will try the best that I can to pause and walk with that person to that building. And that gives me a chance to talk to the person and learn about them. And I get to get some fresh air. Just taking a moment to walk with someone can make a big difference. And it can help both of us to get a little break from what we're doing and to learn about each other.
This is Ready, Test, Go, brought to you by Applause, the podcast on software quality and digital experiences. I'm David Carty. Today's guests are material meditators and value-sensitive design pioneers, Batya Friedman and David Hendry. They are renowned researchers at the University of Washington, as well as the co-authors of Value-Sensitive Design, its second edition published in April. Together, they established a practical framework that helps engineers, creators, and technology leaders account for human values throughout the product lifecycle. Engineering teams are typically measured by what they can ship. The focus lands on performance, reliability, and scale, understandably so, but the systems they build also deeply shape user privacy, dignity, and trust. So, how can we bring these critical human values into product development before conflicts emerge? How can we identify and reduce both direct and indirect harms? And can we treat criteria like fairness and autonomy as seriously as cost? Let's explore moral imagination with our first podcast duo, Batya and David. Batya, let's start with you. Your work began with a very practical engineering concern. How do I know whether what I'm building will actually be helpful to people? What a novel concept, right? What was missing from the technology world at that time? And how did that gap lead you toward the concept of value-sensitive design?
So this was way back in the early 80s or so. I was starting off as a software engineer. And actually the question I was asking myself as a young software engineer was, how could I be a little bit more certain that the things, or confident that the things I was going to build would be beneficial to people in their lives for the things that really mattered to them? And so, I did what anybody does. I started looking for other people who'd already figured that out so I could, learn from them and borrow their ideas, borrow their tools, their methods. I didn't find exactly what I needed to do my work as a builder and a designer. So, for example, there were a group of people, moral philosophers, who at that time were beginning to ask questions about how computing technology was changing maybe some of our moral ideas about what was privacy, what counts as privacy, fundamental ideas about property or ownership. And they were asking these conceptual kinds of questions, but they weren't builders. So their ideas were really important, but they didn't tell me how to make something differently. Also, at that time, there were some very early sociologists who were starting to study how digital technologies were changing the workplace. And so they were going into workplaces and watching how people were doing their work, actually not unlike when Dave was talking about, these notions of collective work, what kinds of things were happening. But they were documenting how work and how people's interactions were changing given a technology. And so again, not builders, but after the fact. And I wanted to be on the front end. What do we imagine? What do we build? What do we design? There were two groups of people who were builders or designers. One of them it was a body of work that was coming out of Scandinavia at the time called participatory design, the very beginnings of participatory design. And in the Scandinavian context, what you saw, this was work that was going on in the workplace. So, you have an organization, has a management layer, it has workers. And the Scandinavian countries, some of them had implemented something that was called co-determination laws. So, for example, management could decide to go out and build a big system, to change the workflow, maybe automate parts of the work. And workers didn't have a say about that. But when the system showed up, they did have a veto power. They could say, yes, we'll take the system, or no, we won't. And so for management, that incentivized them to make sure that whatever they spent quite a lot of money building, when it actually arrived in their organization, workers were going to be enthusiastic about. And that led to this field and practice of participatory design that would involve some of the workers in the actual design process, and actually led to a lot of the methods that we see today and think of as user-centered design, but early prototyping, getting feedback from users early on in the process, and so forth. It required, first of all, these laws, and also they were designing within a very confined environment, so very specific management, very specific kinds of workers. And I was in an environment where we're thinking about designing things like pencils, like a browser, right? Who's the manager? How broad are the people who are going to be using it in different cultures and contexts and so forth? So there are definite ideas that I could borrow from the Scandinavian context, but again, not applicable really to the kind of contexts that I thought I would be working in. And then one other group in the research labs in some places like Xerox PARC, you would have small groups of people who knew each other, were trusted people to each other, who were designing their own tools to support their own remote collaborative work. And so again, they were engaging values, but also they were very particular contexts. They were all knowledgeable about the technology. They knew each other. They had trust already. We're not talking about building tools that would be used by strangers. And so again, some things that one could learn there, but really not yet a set of tools and methods and theoretical constructs or orientations to help us understand how to work on the browser, right? Think about that. How do you build a pencil, really? How do you build a pencil, a general utility tool that by and large is going to be beneficial to people and in all kinds of walks and all kinds of applications, etc. So those were the questions I was asking. I didn't intend to start working on something like value-sensitive design. It's just that as I tried to answer that, I realized it was a hard problem, and it required a lot of thought from a lot of people over a long period of time to make progress, which I think we have.
Yeah, and that historical context is very, very helpful, Batya. Thank you. Uh, David, to bring it over to you, value sensitive design is about building practical systems, even as technology changes all around us. So, how do you explain this connection to maybe engineering or product teams that are really focused on delivery and on those outcomes that they're building toward?
Let's take a product team within an organization. With value sensitive design, we begin with the idea of human flourishing and the quality and impact of the work that is taking place within that organization. And then we ask the question, well, what kind of social conditions, what kinds of technological conditions do we need in order to support that really strong work that leads to human flourishing? We might begin with the proposition that for employees to be effective in that organization, they themselves need to flourish. And the tools that they use and the kind of work that is presented to them and designed for them is a really important aspect of that. From that, framing, let's begin with that framing, which is a narrower framing than the one that Batya presented just a moment ago, but maybe it will be helpful. We in the value sensitive design community, and very specifically in our book, have a set of methods and a set of heuristics for applying those methods so that organizations can innovate around their engineering process by, for example, asking both direct and indirect stakeholders, the people that are using the technologies and those that are being impacted by the technologies, what's important to them, what values matter to them, and then using those insights that we have through the methods that we have developed in order to move the innovation, the engineering process forward. My goodness, I said a lot there. But you can think that it begins with an overarching commitment to the quality of work and human flourishing that's tied to that work in the organizational context, and then a set of methods and a methodology and a set of principles for applying those methods that leads to good social and technical conditions.
And to that point, Batya and David, you argue that human values can function as design criteria in what we're building. From top to bottom, what does it look like for a team, an organization to treat human values like dignity, privacy, care, fairness, autonomy? There's a lot that apply there. What does it look like for them to apply that as seriously as performance, cost, or reliability, those sorts of outcomes that we mentioned before?
Let's move from an organizational framing to a specific kind of artifact. Let's suppose that we're tasked with building a robot that is able to care for people who have a hard time getting out of a chair and into a bed, for example. So this is a lifting robot, a robot that lifts people from one place to another. And we can imagine a set of different technological approaches to that problem, right? We have different ways of achieving the goal of lifting people from one place to another. Let's begin with a relatively autonomous robot that is like a robot that you might see in the Jetsons, who it looks like a robot. It stands on its own, and it is able to lift someone up. And let's suppose that the person who's being lifted is looking at the robot's face and is looking for attention. Well, we might say that that person is looking for the robot to understand their situation as they're being moved from one place to another. And that robot might have a certain kind of performance characteristics and a certain kind of cost, but clearly that robot doesn't have the capacity to attend to the person that's being lifted, even if the person might expect that. So we've now identified a value, attention, that is tied to the notion of caring for someone, that is caring for someone as they're being lifted. And in fact, we maybe won't go into this in too much detail, but there's a whole area of care ethics that has a set of values and a set of commitments about the concept of care. And one of those commitments is attention. So we might evaluate this solution, this technical direction, as fine for cost, fine for feasibility, fine for performance. But in terms of attention, it falls short. It just is not able to attend to the person. Now, let's suppose we have a different kind of solution. Let's suppose we move towards an exoskeleton solution where the robot is worn by a human being, and the robot gives the human being more power, more endurance for lifting people all day long. And now we dress up in our exoskeleton, and then we're able to move through a home or a facility, and we're able to lift people up all day long. Now, in that kind of scenario, a person is able to directly look at the person they're lifting, and they can have attention, and they have the same performance characteristics as the autonomous robot. Does that make sense? Is that clear? We have two solutions, an exoskeleton solution and then an embodied self-standing robot solution. And both of them have the same kind of performance characteristics, but in one case we have an exoskeleton and the person is able to attend to the patient as they're lifting. So that solution has a set of engineering criteria, one of which is attention, as we've identified, and that would do well on that criteria because the person can look directly in the eyes of the patient. Let's suppose we bring this idea into a home for elders, and these nurses put on the exoskeleton and they try it out in a field study. What do you suppose, or what is one thing that we might learn through a study like that?
Well, I suppose if I'm being put on the spot, I would answer how it impacts the people around them, right? How it works in tight corners, an old elevator, for example, something like that, right? How it's basically going to work in the environment that it is placed in.
That's fabulous. So you're raising all these contextual aspects of how it would work in a real place. Well, in this hypothetical example, let's suppose that when these employees put on the exoskeleton, they don't feel so great about that. They feel a little yucky, right? Because they're being kind of turned into a robot, right? Their bodies are being changed by this robotic thing. And it could be that in some contexts, that's really cool and people want to do that. But in other kinds of contexts, that's not something that's very desirable. So that kind of empirical study in context might teach us about what's really important to those people that you might not otherwise learn about until you did that intervention. And we might call that bodily integrity, so that people ask for bodily integrity as they're lifting others, for the people that are doing the lifting. We've identified a new value, bodily integrity, that becomes an engineering criteria now for us. And we see that the exoskeleton is falling short on that criteria as well. So that leads us to more thinking, more imagination, and then we move to, an automatic lift type of solution that allows a person to have a lot of control over the lifting process, but does not involve an embodied robot type solution. It could have a lot of technology, a lot of robotic technology, but it's being positioned as a tool that allows for both attention and for bodily integrity, along with these other engineering criteria for cost and feasibility and function and so forth. So in a short period of time, Batya and I have talked out, a really complicated engineering process, like how do you build a useful lifting robot? And we've explored how values can be turned into criteria for making evaluations of different technical solutions.
So just to also point out some of the things that Dave embedded in his example as he was talking it out, one thing to notice is that he took into account both of what we would call the stakeholders. So one stakeholder was the person who needed to be lifted, but a second stakeholder was the caregiver. So initially, the caregiver isn't involved until we see that the stand-alone robot doesn't meet the needs of the person needing to be lifted. And then all of a sudden, they become implicated also as a direct stakeholder. So you can see how as you shift in your solutions, who counts as a stakeholder can change as well. It's also the case that as these engineering criteria were applied, they were not only criteria for evaluating a possible design, they were also design prompts for the next innovation or the next iteration. So they can work both in an evaluative way, but they can also work in a stimulating way for as design constraints, as where to go next or how to design within. And then you also saw embedded here what we call the tripartite methodology. And this is core to value-sensitive design. Really, the claim is that if we're going to make progress here, we need to engage with the technology. So we need to do these technical investigations, like coming up with a standalone robot, coming up with the exoskeleton, coming up with this other kind of automated lift. We also need to conceptualize the values, what things people care about. So there's the sort of unarticulated value, that sense of, oh, it doesn't feel good to me. And we need to move from there to what is it that really is problematic and come up with very clear definitions so that we can use them practically as evaluation criteria and also as design constraints going forward. And so you saw that in the way in which the original performance criteria fall short, and then we come to understand that attention from a care ethics point of view analytically is a piece that's really important. And then the third part of the tripartite methodology is empirical. And what that means is that we can do a huge amount of work, sitting in our offices or our labs, building things, etc. But, the rubber hits the road with people and how they experience things in their lived lives, individually within their families, communities, organizations, cultures. We need to go to those environments and to the representatives of those individuals to understand what it is that they actually experience. And in this case, with the exoskeleton, you saw that the caregiver, once they put that on, objected to critical aspects. And so other design criteria, value-oriented design criteria, emerged from that stimulated yet further design. So all of these things that I have in some ways been extracting out of the example that Dave gave form the core theoretical constructs of value-sensitive design, where we talk about tools and technology, what the values are, stakeholders, the notion of an interactional theory that fundamentally we need to pay attention to all of the interactions as they unfold, and then this tripartite methodology, these three different kinds of investigations, technical, conceptual, empirical, that need to be employed iteratively and integratively. So it's not just a one-shot linear thing, but one keeps circling back. And you saw Dave do that as he continued to refine the evaluation criteria and then the technical options.
You're touching on this a little bit now, but let's try to take this to an actionable standpoint, right? Many organizations already have requirements documents, UX customer research, right? Risk reviews and governance processes, things like that. So when you think about how all of this feeds into the product development lifecycle, where does value-sensitive design fit into the lifecycle and those existing workflows? And where might it require teams to rethink the way that they build products?
So the quick and easy off-the-cuff answer to that is from the very beginning through to the very end, following deployment and remaining alert afterwards. So these are really sustained commitments. And in fact, value-sensitive design was designed, and the reason it's called value-sensitive design and not value-centered design is that it was intended to heighten sensitivity to value considerations and to be used alongside of, integrated with, our very best technical practices. So the idea for any organization, say, that's building or conceptualizing technology, is to do your very best technical work in the way in which you know how to do it. And alongside of that, integrate value-sensitive design practices from the very beginning all the way through. So, for example, Stephen Umbrello and some colleagues have looked at agile programming practices and have developed some guides for how someone who is doing agile programming as a practice can integrate value sensitive design very naturally into what they're doing. So, in some cases, if you have a practice that already pays attention to users, who within value sensitive design we would call the direct stakeholders, the people who interact directly with the technology, there's an opportunity to just broaden that to consider indirect stakeholders, those who are going to be impacted by the technology but might not touch it themselves. I was actually visiting many, many years ago some colleagues in Sweden who had been designing a system to be used in operating rooms. And they were talking about the work they had done with the surgeons and the surgeon assistants and others who were in the room and who would be using this new technology they were developing. And given value sensitive design and its framing around indirect stakeholders as well, I said, oh, what about the patient on the operating table? And they said, oh, oh my, yeah, we do need to consider that. And you could see their faces light up and their minds start to whirl at the impact of what they were designing on the patient, even though the patient wasn't going to interact with that technology directly. And then, they took that. They were off and running with their design processes. So I think these are some examples. I think another couple very important pieces are Dave's point about evaluation criteria, that we use these things we discover about values both in a very generative and imaginative way at different brainstorming points in the design process, but also all along the way as evaluation criteria. So if we have, concerns about privacy or concerns about human attention, at every step along the way where you or have a fork in the road, and you're going to say, which direction do we go, that you hold on to those value criteria and use them to help you evaluate and choose. And then, of course, sometimes criteria or the outcome of evaluation criteria can be in opposition to each other. And so we also need ways to examine those tensions and resolve them in meaningful ways. And sometimes that itself becomes the stimulus for further innovation and leads us to actual better, more satisfying solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that these examples are really helpful when we're thinking about all of these concepts. And, that's sort of what your envisioning cards do as well. We can add a link to these in our podcast notes. Explain how these work and how these prompts help teams surface issues that they might otherwise miss.
So the envisioning cards are a versatile toolkit for considering values in different ways. Oh, there's a picture.
Mm-hmm.
There's an example. And they cover different criteria, envisioning criteria, including stakeholders, values, pervasiveness, and time, and also multi-lifespan. We can talk about that criteria in a second. So those 5 dimensions, those 5 envisioning criteria are suits in our card deck. And then within each of those suits, within each of those envisioning criteria, there are a set of cards that orient the design team, the engineering team, to particular kinds of considerations of their project. So there's a card, it's called Perceptions of a Value. And then there's an evocative image on the front of the card, and then on the back, there's a description of what perceptions of a value is all about, and then a particular activity. In this case, it's an investigative activity. And those prompts orient a design team towards particular considerations of that card. So this card-based toolkit brings many of the theoretical constructs of value-sensitive design and some of its key methodological moves into this toolkit.
So part of what was at stake for us in developing the envisioning cards was a sense from, well, just what you were asking, industry or organizations. A lot of people will say, look, I'm trained as an engineer. I'm a technical person. I'm not a moral philosopher. How do I know what's right or wrong? Yeah, this idea of moral imagination, it just paralyzes me. What do I do? And plus, I don't have a lot of time. So the challenge to us then was, how could we develop a toolkit that we could put in the hands of designers, engineers, that they could use with confidence in very quickly, that would perhaps not lead to perfect systems, but would lead to better systems. And we just tried to lower the stakes and say, let's make progress. Focus on progress, not perfection. You don't have to get it right. Just, can you get it a little bit better than you would have otherwise if you invest a small amount of time? Our envisioning cards come with a 3-minute timer. And the idea is that if you choose a card for your design project and spend 3 minutes, you will generate material that will help you lead toward a better design. That's the commitment that we ask for in terms of time and resources. And perhaps this would be a nice time to demonstrate that.
Absolutely, yeah. We've agreed to a demonstration, so go ahead and walk me through the sleeve activity, and I'll do the best I can.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is, sleeve is a technology. I'm going to read from the book the description of this technology, so we're all on the same page here. Um, Sleeve is a hypothetical wearable technology that uses a brain-computer interface to detect the wearer's affective states, then displays those affects through an e-textile garment. The fabric can change colors, texture, and shape according to the feelings of the wearer. Sleeve can be worn by people, for example, those who have autistic friends, to help make the wearer's emotions more accessible to the people around them. So, to recap, the idea is, if I'm wearing a sleeve, I've got something embedded back here connecting a brain interface to my clothing. And as I have different kinds of emotions, it's going to change things in the texture of what I'm wearing, maybe the colors, various sorts of things. And then those people who are around me see my fabric changing. All right, so that's the technology that we're talking about. And the card I'd like to bring forward and have you work with, David, is called Value Tensions. You can see the word value tension there, and this funny image of a crosswalk sign that can't quite figure out if it's time to cross or time to stop. The value tensions card is part of the values criteria, and I'm going to read to you the theme here and then the design instruction and ask you to engage that for a few minutes. So, what are value tensions? Value tensions occur when supporting one value in a technology challenges another value. So, for example, sharing more information in a social networking system may support sociability but reduce privacy. They can occur within a single individual, like within myself, conformity versus autonomy, between an individual and a group, so individual privacy versus national security, or across different groups, so a culture that values independence versus a culture that values interdependence. So this is the idea, the theme of value tensions. So are you ready for your design prompt now that you'll use in relation to sleeve? Remember that technology with the brain-machine interface that changes my clothing based on what I'm feeling. All
I'll
right.
do the best I can.
Okay, and I've got my 3-minute timer here. So I'm going to ask you to brainstorm 3 value tensions that your system might engage. So 3 value tensions that you see in sleeve. For each value tension, I want you to identify one or more design feature that favors one of the values over another. So think about 3 different value tensions and then connect that to the actual features of the technology. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Great. Well, I'm flipping over the timer. Go for it.
We just fast forwarded a little bit, and these will be very brief answers for the purposes of time. But some of the examples that came to mind for me, I have three very quick ones. One, preferred color versus a preferred color in a different culture. So, what colors are represented in that product choice? What do they mean in the existing location versus if that product gets launched somewhere else? So, you have to decide on one versus another, or you have to design for different color preferences in your different target markets. Another one that came to mind for me is convenience to the user versus convenience to the indirectly affected user. So the person that is wearing the sleeve might prefer to have their emotions telegraphed to other people for any number of reasons, but maybe not everybody around them want to receive that information for any number of reasons. For example, a difficult emotion might be perceived by somebody else in a way that is aggressive or triggering to them. So that is another sort of push and pull there. And then another one is privacy versus lack thereof, or versus openness, right? So obviously, that person that is wearing that sleeve is agreeing to at all times be using that product in displaying that emotion. And essentially, what they're doing is on an ongoing basis neglecting their right to privacy as it pertains to their emotions. And maybe that user doesn't understand the extent to which that product works when they put it on. How red does it get if you are angry? What are the actual defined emotions? So there's a lot there, but I think the example is really emblematic of what we've been talking about so far. Now, engineering teams often encounter value conflicts rather than very clear, correct answers, right? How should leaders try to guide these teams when things like privacy, accessibility, safety, transparency, business goals, user autonomy, there's a lot there, when they're all sort of pulling in different directions?
I think what you just experienced with the work that you did around sleeve points in that direction. So, one thing that's, I think, very important and helpful is actually surfacing what the specific value tensions are. If you just have a feeling of tension or you know, something here, something there, you're not so well positioned as a designer or engineer to try to mitigate that. But if you can make those tensions explicit, then you can begin to look for what I call sweet spots in the design, where one is able to strike a really good balance. So, for example, you brought up the question of different colors meaning something different in different cultures, right? So one solution is, well, we have a dominant culture. We pick the colors that work there. And those are, you know, defaults, user beware. Or one could just design something where people are able to either initially, as they set up their system, input where they're coming from culturally or where they expect to be using this culturally. And have colors associated with that, or be able to explicitly say what kinds of colors they want associated with what kinds of emotions. That, of course, challenges standardization. They have to make sure the people around them know what those mappings are. But that pushes a design team to look for adaptations that may make the kind of technology they're designing work better for the people that they're designing for with respect to the things that those groups of people value. So that's just a way of talking to your point. I think another comment I would make is that in social life, in our lived lives, even in ourselves singly as individuals, we exist with value tensions. That is the nature. That is our nature. So we're actually really quite experienced with this. We navigate value tension all the time. And so I think we can draw on these things that we know intuitively rather than seeing the tensions themselves as stopping points or things that are insurmountable to us. We should recognize that we're quite facile at this and require ourselves as engineers and technologists to engage them directly And then I think we'll learn from that. We'll develop methods, practices, we'll get better at it. So engage it, I would say, engage those value tensions directly.
I would just add that working definitions are your friend. So the list of values that you just laid out are very abstract. So having organizations and design teams develop working definitions can be a very helpful way of unparalyzing yourself from those kinds of ideas, those notions of privacy and safety and so on. And then related to that, as demonstrated with the lifting robot, working with your working definitions in context helps to really give you concrete ideas for what is at stake with a particular value and for identifying those sweet spots that Batya was referring to.
Okay, our first ever two-person lightning round. So I guess we'll go Batya first and then David second, just for the sake of picking in order. So first, what is the most important characteristic of a high-quality application?
I would say respecting dignity. Historically, I might have said human dignity, but I think as we see how our technologies are implicating all kinds of other creatures in the planet, then we need to apply dignity more broadly.
I would add on to that an accounting for the material and environmental impacts of the technology that's being developed at scale.
What should software development organizations be doing more of?
So much. I have to say, truthfully, I am fairly disappointed with ourselves as software engineers. I think that in the 80s and early 90s, we had a lot of hope and a lot of kinds of commitments that I see have fallen by the wayside. What I would really like to see is technologists returning to these basic principles about making things that really do support human flourishing and flourishing of the planet, and that those become our fundamental criteria.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to echo about you here. Software development organizations need to have the courage to say no.
What should software development organizations be doing less of?
Well, I think this is the sort of the flip side. So now I'm going to say what they should be doing more of. They should be using tools and methods and principles like those in value-sensitive design to help stimulate their moral and technical imaginations to identify technologies that make sense on our planet, given the nature of our planet and its resources, and given the nature of human beings who are embodied and who feel good when we touch each other and when we see each other and talk to each other, and hold ourselves accountable for technologies we're designing which are really leading to, I would say, dis-ease, uncomfort, illness on the planet and among people.
I think they should be doing less capitalism and more local economic activity. That is, we're in a place where monolithic systems are being developed that totalize our experience of information. We need to be doing less of that, and we need to be more fully exploring the opportunities of placing information within local environments and local cultures to support, just as Batya said, human flourishing.
And final question, again, we'll go Batya, then David. What is something that you are hopeful for?
Fundamentally, I'm hopeful for human beings. I'm hopeful for our imaginations, moral and technical. I feel like if we make these commitments and challenge ourselves, we really can engineer well.
I'm hopeful for young people. I was teaching a class this last quarter in the springtime. The students that I was working with, the students that I got to engage with every week, are really, really interested in the challenges that we have. I'm hopeful that they will learn and they will help us address our challenges.
Little intellectual curiosity goes a long way, and it's always nice to end on this hopeful note. So thank you so much for your really thoughtful responses today, and we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Appreciate the depth and thoughtfulness Batya and David brought to the discussion today. You can find the link to the second edition of Value Sensitive Design in our podcast notes. And for those of you that prefer a tactile experience when reading, they do offer physical copies as well. Thank you to our producers Joe Stella and Sam Susala, editor Ian Lippincott, and graphic designer Carly Searles. Subscribe to Ready Test Go on your favorite podcast player. It really helps us out. Or watch our video episodes on our website, applause.com. You can also subscribe to the Applause YouTube channel. The handle for that is applause.com. And if you have feedback or a guest recommendation, go ahead and send them our way. Reach out to us directly at podcasts@applause.com. Thank you for joining us.